Yet another indication that the slowdown is worsening. The industrial output data for June has shown a contraction, yet again adding to the growing number of worries for policymakers. Hello and welcome to We Mean Business. I'm Shweta Rajpal-Kohli, and the question we're asking on the show is whether high interest rates are hurting the growth and what needs to be done to revive the Indian economy. Let me introduce our guests on the show today. I spoke earlier with Mr. Adi Godrej, Chairman of the Godrej Group and President of CII. We've also got with us here Mr. R.V. Kanoria, President of FICCI, also Mr. T.V. Mohandas Pai, Chairman of Manipal Global Education Services Limited, joins us from Bangalore. With me here in the Delhi studio, Nalan Kohli, National Executive Member of the BJP, and we've got Sajid Chenoy, India Economist of JP Morgan in Mumbai, and Mr. Mukesh Agarwal, President of CRISIL Research, also joining us from Mumbai. Thank you all for being with us here on the show. But let me start with the interview that I had done with Mr. Adi Godrej earlier. Mr. Godrej, hope clearly building up that Mr. Chidambaram is now in charge and things can change very quickly. Are you sharing that hope and optimism?
Yes, I think the statement he made on Monday was very refreshing. I think he clearly tackled all the major areas that need attention. He has very categorically stated that he would like to take action in several different fields, and I do expect that this will be done in the near future and that economic growth will revive quite well.
Mr. Godrej, the big question we are trying to address on the show today is whether high interest rates particularly are hurting growth, and are you hopeful that interest rates will be brought down over the next few months? I
do feel so. I am very hopeful that interest rates can be brought down over the rest of the calendar year. I feel that the Reserve Bank was waiting for government action on the fiscal and other fronts, which Chidambaram has clearly enunciated, and Reserve Bank should work on inflationary expectations, with the Finance Minister promising to work on the fiscal deficit front, especially with appointment of a very high-powered committee under Mr. Kelkar. I expect that the Reserve Bank will take cognizance of this and reduce the rates, because the high interest rates is definitely contributing very strongly to the GDP growth slowdown. Two ways. One is investments into new industrial and infrastructure capacity is affected, but even more importantly, I think consumption of many items that depend on financing, for example, residential housing, autos, etc., has slowed down very considerably because interest rates and financing costs and mortgage rates are very high. So bringing down interest rates will certainly give a boost to growth. But Mr. Godrej, the Reserve Bank of India has held a view that higher interest rates are not necessarily hampering growth, and also the fact that lowering interest rates may not necessarily help growth. How do you respond to that? No, I don't agree with that, and that's not the stand the Reserve Bank is saying. They are saying that high interest costs are not the only thing that is affecting growth. They are right about that. There are many other things that need to be done, which also Mr. Chidambaram has addressed. But clearly, high interest rates are having an effect on growth. All right, high interest rates clearly hurting growth. Mr. Godrej, we have some good news that we have a new finance minister in charge, but there's also some bad news that's pouring in, a deficient monsoon. Can the finance minister really meet his promises on fiscal consolidation, given that his challenges have become even more intense now with the possibility of a drought? Yes, true. But there are many ways the fiscal deficit can be addressed. Of course, one of them is subsidies. I think that needs to be done, because otherwise we'll be even derated by the global rating agencies. And that's very important, because otherwise our cost of debt, etc., will rise. Secondly, disinvestment is a very good way to create fiscal consolidation. Disinvestment opportunities are large, and if you start disinvestment, if fiscal deficit starts coming down, RBI takes action, a virtuous cycle is built whereby even more disinvestment can be undertaken. So a combination of this can certainly contain the fiscal deficit, and I'm sure an expert committee under Mr. Kelkar will do a good job in advising the government what is the best way to go about it. Despite the monsoon being deficient and despite drought-like conditions in some parts of the country, I think this can be tackled and it will be successfully tackled.
Mr. Godrej, do we see the finance minister focusing on big ticket reforms, and what according to you should be his top priorities? Many actually say that you should just forget about reforms because he actually has a very narrow window of opportunity and he may like to actually focus on many other things. It is a long list out there.
I don't agree with this window being narrow philosophy which is being touted around, because I think reforms will help politically. I think people seem to feel that reforms will hurt politically. I don't agree with that philosophy. If you look at the state elections during the last 5 years, all the reformists, state governments, all the governments that created high growth rates have been re-elected. So I think politically reform will help the ruling coalition, and I think they will go ahead with it.
Mr. Godrej, also ironically, in the week that the finance minister has made such bold statements, we've also seen a number of growth downgrades coming in, mainly because of the possibility of a drought, the fact that we're now possibly in a drought year. Do you also think that growth can slip to 5.5% levels this year and that we may not even make it to the 6% mark?
If the reform program is not implemented well, it could slip. The growth could slip. If the reform program is implemented well, we could get on the path of accelerated growth. And if the reform program is really well implemented, and if GST is implemented at the same time, I feel we could grow at over 8%, probably close to 9% in 13-14, if the reform program is taken forward briskly.
Mr. Godrej, if there's something that has clearly dampened investor sentiment more than anything else in the last few months, it's perhaps been some of those taxation changes introduced in the budget, the retrospective amendments as well as GAR. Do you see Mr. Chidambaram moving forward in trying to undo that damage?
Yes, I think if you read his statement carefully, you can see that he has also referred to that. And his statements are more or less in line with what CII has been saying. I think the perception of India has suffered on several counts. One of them was the GAR and retrospective amendments. Recently, the Maruti incident and the failure of the grid has added to that negative perception, and we need to correct that. So I think not only do I think it will help the perception very considerably if these retrospective amendments and the GAR issue are adequately tackled, I do feel that they will do it.
All right, tackling some of those issues is important, but also equally important is perhaps building political consensus. There continue to be political compulsions. That clearly hasn't changed. So are you still hopeful that reforms like GST or FDI and multi-brand retail can go through despite the opposition coming from allies as well as the opposition? They've clearly not been too helpful.
Yes, I feel so, because CII has discussed it with the opposition parties. We have discussed it with the state governments. I think it needs careful analysis by both sides. Give and take is required, and I think it can be done if strong effort is made in that direction.
Mr. Godrej, what according to you can be the best case and the worst case scenario in terms of growth for this year? In the next few months, how quickly do you think can we turn around this is the situation right now, or do you think there are chances that we could even slip further?
Well, I am not overly concerned about this financial year. Of course, I think the worst could be 5.5% growth, and the best for this financial year I see is about a 6.5% growth. But I'm more concerned about the next financial year, because we should concentrate on that so that there is a revival in the next financial year. For the next financial year, if we do nothing, I expect growth will remain at around 6%. But if we act on all fronts, including the goods and services tax and the constitutional amendment relating to the goods and services tax, I think we can grow up to 9% in the next financial year.
Mr. Godrej, before we wrap up, what's your advice for Mr. Chidambaram as the president of CII? What, according to you, should be the prescription for growth here on?
I think all action should be taken in terms of the reform program. I think the agenda is well known. CII has initiated a 10-point plan. I think Mr. Chidambaram's statement on Monday was excellent. And I think if we move on that path, we can see accelerated growth in India. And that will create a sort of a virtuous cycle which will take other things forward too.
That was Mr. Adi Godrej, President of CII and Chairman of the Godrej Group, who I spoke with earlier. Let me take forward some of the points that he's raised to our panel.